Okay, sorry for the bad quality, but I figured it'd be best just to do a quick video to send you this to go over these contracts. So we'll go over a few documents. This one is going to be called the Agreement to Buy and Sell Residential Real Estate. It just starts with the parties. You got your buyer and seller here you fill out. The next section that you fill out, you pick the closing attorney. So the buyer and the seller both pick their own closing attorney, but it's usually the buyer that's filling out this offer letter. So this is the attorney that the buyer plans to use. So you'll put them here in this section. This section just says if the buyer or seller is a residential real estate agent, you have to check the box. Usually you're not. So if you're representing the buyer, you get them to sign here that says the buyer acknowledges receipt of the South Carolina brokerage disclosure form and that they are choosing to be a client or a customer. And we'll go over the South Carolina brokerage disclosure form in just a minute. So basically they'll initial here and check the box to say they're a client or a customer, depending on what you guys decide on. Next section is the purchase price. You just fill that in. So this section says, how are you buying it? Is it financed? Is it combination? Is it cash? So you'll need to pick one of those three. The verification of cash available at closing is attached, not attached, to be delivered. Most of the time, nobody fills that out. If you have like a pre-approval letter or a proof of funds letter, you could select attached, but most sellers kind of expect that to come with the offer. The next one is important. It says this contract is or is not contingent on the sale of the buyer closing on their home. So if you have a buyer that's wanting to do a home sale contingency, it gets a lot more complicated, but hopefully this example, it was contingent, so I selected is, but hopefully they're selecting is not. And if it is contingent, there's another form you have to fill out, which basically tells the seller more about the house that the buyer is selling, so they can look into it to see if it's worth them considering this offer. Section 3 just talks about the property. You're just going to have the address and as much information here as you can get in there. This section right here is important. It says parties agree to no personal property. So in South Carolina, I'm sure it's the same in Colorado, but the refrigerator, washer, dryer, things that aren't connected to the property normally do not convey. So if your buyer wants the refrigerator, washer, dryer, I usually put blinds, curtains, anything like that. Sometimes I see people put light fixtures. I just had actually this contract we're looking at here, the seller actually took down a light fixture, but right before closing, and the buyer was really upset about it. So you can specify here what the buyer wants in the property. Section 4 talks about the closing date. So this is when the buyer wants to close. You can usually leave this section blank. Section 5 talks about the earnest money. So earnest money is to be paid usually traditionally 2 days after a contract's ratified. And here you put who's holding it, which will be the buyer's attorney. Here you put what date you plan to have the buyer give the earnest money to the attorney by, and what method they plan to pay, whether check, cash, or other. And then here you'd write the other method. Typical is about 1%. A lot of agents try to get away with a 0.5%. Some people try to go with $1,000, but a good offer is usually about 1% of the purchase price. Usually nothing here. Section 6 is transaction cost. So this paragraph here talks about if you're in an HOA and the HOA charges what's called a capital contribution. The person buying the house is normally going to pay that, but if you select seller, then the seller will be paying that capital contribution, or some HOAs call it a transfer fee. So it's just if it's an HOA, you need to be aware if there's transfer fees or capital contributions and select the appropriate box there. This is closing costs that the buyer is requesting that the seller pay on their behalf. So if you leave it blank, this means the buyer is paying their closing cost. If you put $5,000 in here, that means the seller is paying the buyer's closing cost of $5,000 or up to $5,000. You're always going to initial at the bottom of each page. Section 7 talks about financing. Is it contingent? Is this contract contingent on financing? Yes or no? And if it is, what type of financing is it? And if you know how much percentage they plan on putting down, that would go here. If you don't know it, if it's FHA, I usually just put 3.5. Put the most. So I'm sorry, this is not percent they're putting down, it's the percent of the loan amount. So if it's a VA loan, it's going to be 100%. If it's FHA, you're probably going to go with 96.5. But you'll have to ask the buyer what they want. So they should be pre-approved already, but if they're not, this is when they should apply for pre-approval. This is basically when they get their clear to close. I always put the closing date here. And then this is basically saying if you change lenders, how many days do you need to notify the seller? You usually always want to put 1 there. Here's the lender's information and what type of loan you're doing. Section 8 is a due diligence period. In South Carolina, that's all we have, which is a period of time that the buyer can back out of the deal for any reason whatsoever, and they can do all their inspections during this period. Typical is about 7 days. And if you scroll down here is the termination fee. So basically, if the buyer exercises their right to back out and exercises the right to use this due diligence, this termination fee is what they have to pay to exercise that right. If you're representing the buyer, you're always going to want this number as low as possible. If you're representing the seller, of course, you're going to want that number as high as possible. Section 9 just talks more about the right to inspect. Here it talks about utilities. I always put in here that the seller to leave utilities on until day of closing because sometimes they'll cut them off. And if you check this box, this basically says the seller's granting the buyer a right to turn on the utilities for inspection purposes. So you usually just want the seller to leave them on. Section 10 is the contract contingent on the appraisal of the house, yes or no. Of course, if the house doesn't appraise, you have to go back into negotiations. Section 11 is a wood infestation report, which you may not be familiar with in Colorado, but we have termites down here. So if you say it is contingent, then you have to get a CL 100 inspection. And if there's termites or wood rot damage on the house, the seller must fix those things and then get this report cleared. Somebody will have to go back out and say, okay, everything is fixed. And if you say it is contingent, you have to click who's paying for it, who's picking it, who's scheduling it. It can't be done more than 30 days prior to closing, so I usually put 15 days here, which is the date that you have to have it done by. So between 30 and 15 days before closing. 12, nothing to fill out here, just talks about surveys. 13, nothing to do there. 14 talks about home warranty, whether you're going to provide one or not. 15, nothing to do. 16, this is the seller's disclosure statement, which is on the MLS for each listing. So you select here if the buyer has acknowledged they have read it or if they have not read it. Lead-based paint, if it's built before 1978, you have to have a lead-based paint form, which this house is not. Nothing to do on sex offender information. 19, you have to select whether the earnest money can be in an interest-bearing account or not. I normally just say may not. Nothing in 20, nothing in 21, or 22, or 23, or 24, 25, 26, or 27. 28 is anything additional that you want to put in here. So like if you're doing an escalation clause, if you have some other contingencies the buyer wants to put in, you can type it in here. Or if it's more complicated, you could just type in C addendum, and then you have another form where you could have another addendum form where you could put whatever you wanted on that form. Nothing here. 31 is the expiration of the offer. There's really nothing typical here. I like to usually do 24 hours, but you can pressure if you want to as the buyer. Usually leave this section blank because it talks about a witness. You have your buyer sign. People always forget to have them initial this page. They'll sign it and forget to initial. Always initial and sign that page. This is where you put the seller's real estate information. I'm sorry, this is the seller. And then down here is the real estate information for each agent. And then again, people forget to initial this last page all the time. So that is the agreement to buy and sell real estate as quickly as I could go over it.